the thing that really separates IBS from just irregularity, because not all constipation is IBS and not all diarrhea is IBS. What makes IBS is the chronic abdominal pain. Pain is what separates IBS from just, I have loose stools, or I go to the bathroom a lot, or I'm constipated. It's the pain.
If you're constipated, have diarrhea, or just get bloated and feel uncomfortable with gas, this is the episode for you. I'm joined by Tamara Duker, who is better known as the Bloated Belly Whisperer, and we talk about a lot of what's in her newest book, Regular, and all the different symptoms, causes, and resolutions associated with IBS, IBD, Crohn's, colitis, and just the feeling of fullness and pain from gas. So, again, if you suffer with any kind of digestive discomfort on any level, you're going to want to listen till the very end. Welcome back to the Digest This podcast. I'm your host, Bethany Cameron. Let's get into it. Let me talk about gut health for a second, particularly the gut mucosal barrier. And every year, more and more people are developing gut issues. So why is our gut being so compromised so much? Why is what was designed to protect us from viruses being hit so hard these days and ultimately being suppressed, resulting in poor gut health? Well, our modern living impairs immunity at the mucosa. Each day, our bodies are bombarded by a host of disruptive things that weaken this line of defense. Air pollutants, pesticides in the food and water supply, medications, stress hormones, refined carbohydrates, processed food, and micronutrient deficiencies, among many other factors, disrupt the architecture and make the gut barrier more penetrable. This makes it easy for harmful particles to get inside, including viruses, bacteria, molds, allergens, and environmental toxins. But there's good news, you guys. Colostrum has been clinically shown to help guard against inflammation and everyday toxins and pollutants. There are over 5,000 published studies to date documenting the benefits of colostrum and its ability to optimize health at all stages of life. Colostrum intake has been linked to fewer respiratory tract and GI infections in children and adults, including recent studies showing it's 3 times more effective than the flu vaccine at preventing the flu. That's right. You heard me. Colostrum has been clinically shown to be 3 times more effective than the flu vaccine without any risk or harmful side effects. If you've been following me on Instagram, then you probably have seen me talk about Armra colostrum specifically. Armra colostrum is different. They use a proprietary cold chain biopotent technology that distills over 200 functional nutrients, guaranteeing the highest bioactive integrity and bioavailability. They also only extract and use the surplus colostrum from grass-fed, pasture-raised, happy cows that are no longer needing it to supply their young. So you know you're not taking away from animals that need it. Only the surplus colostrum is used, and Armra makes sure they are getting only the best from healthy USA cows from family farms. Armra has 3 flavors, orange, watermelon, and unflavored, which is my personal favorite because the unflavored has no natural flavors and just one single ingredient. It tastes creamy and kind of just delicious, in my opinion, just kind of like a milky, creamy goodness. And it's suitable for even those with dairy sensitivities because the casein is removed, which is the protein most people with a dairy allergy react to. And Armra has many dairy sensitive customers. And for those who do not have a true allergy, but rather have a dairy intolerance, the culprit is usually not the dairy itself, but rather the way that it is processed. All commercial dairy utilizes high heat and aggressive processing for pasteurization and sterilization. Unfortunately, this changes the structural shape of the proteins and destroys the omega fat molecules, rendering them unrecognizable to the body as a food. This is what triggers the immune system inappropriately, leading to intolerance symptoms like digestive complaints, rashes, and inflammation. However, Armra's innovative cold chain biopotent technology distills colostrum's 200 plus functional nutrients without the use of high temperatures, guaranteeing the highest bioactive integrity and bioavailability. As a result, Armra is actually anti-inflammatory and often well tolerated by customers who typically would have dairy intolerance otherwise. So, if you want to rebuild your whole body microbiome and strengthen your immune barriers along the mouth, sinuses, lungs, gut, urinary, and reproductive tract to block unwelcome particles for your strongest immune health, I highly recommend Armra Colostrum. Go to tryarmra.com and use code DIGEST to receive a special discount for my podcast listeners only. That's tryarmra.com and use code DIGEST to receive a discount. Again, that's tryarmra.com and use code DIGEST. I hope you love it as much as I do. If you're not subscribed to my newsletters, they come out every Friday and they're called Friday Finds. This is information that only my subscribers get in their inbox. I share stuff like non-toxic air fryers and kitchen appliances, new food finds, product recalls, food news, and food products that aren't even on the market yet, but I've got the scoop. This is not published anywhere else and cannot be found on my blog. So be sure you're in the know and subscribe to my weekly newsletters by going to littlesipper.com/subscribe and enter your email. That's all you have to do. So go to littlesipper.com/subscribe to get exclusive information on everything food. Thank you, Tamara, for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so I'm just going to go right into it and come out with a super hot question here. I know we have your book and it just came out. It's called Regular, which is very timely. And so speaking of regular, if someone is not regular, what are some of the little known but very common causes of constipation?
So, one of the most common causes of constipation that is, I think, very little known is something called pelvic floor dysfunction. Right. And so we all kind of get this message that, oh, if you're constipated, it means that you're really slow and you have to just eat more fiber or drink more water or do things that speed you up. But that's not always the case. There are some people who have issues with the coordination of their pelvic floor muscles. And these are a bunch of muscles that are required to really operate and coordinate in a very specific way in order to allow a poop to actually fully exit the body. It's estimated that 40% or more of people with chronic constipation actually suffer from a pelvic floor dysfunction. And that number goes up as we age. And so women after 40 are kind of the hottest group of people with pelvic floor issues, but certainly younger people and men can also experience it. And if you've got pelvic floor dysfunction and you start loading up on fiber, you will probably feel a lot worse and more constipated and not better. That's because more fiber in that you're not really able to release is just going to start building up and building up and building up. And then it makes other remedies like laxatives or medications less effective because things are just kind of pushing up against this wall of just backed up retained stool. And so I think a lot of people who've gotten the message about fiber and are like just going hard on the fiber and not getting relief just find themselves confounded. And it may be that there is just this real more neuromuscular issue going on and they just can't really execute.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like thinking of fiber as a plug, and it's just stopping up that drain.
That is 100% what it is. A colleague of mine, Kate Scarlato, who's a brilliant writer and another GI dietitian, she uses this analogy that I use all the time, which is at a certain point, it's like adding cars to a traffic jam. And that's really what it is. If the roads are just, completely gridlocked and you just put more and more cars on the road, it's not actually going to make the traffic go. And so, yeah, it can actually at a certain point make things better, not worse.
Well, and I can only also speak for myself personally is that some people just don't do well with a lot of fiber, like not even talking about constipation necessarily, but just digestion in general. If I eat a lot of fiber, I sometimes feel it just like it just upsets my gut. Sometimes maybe I will get constipated because I ate so much fiber. So what would you say to the person that maybe is not necessarily constipated? I do want to go back to that topic, but also maybe it's they're having similar issues. They're like, I just can't do fiber. Like, what's the deal?
Yeah, so I spend a lot of pages in my book really dissecting fiber. And so we use the word fiber and as if it's like this monolith and it's just like fiber is fiber. And different fibers have so many different properties. Some fibers are soluble and some are insoluble. Some are high FODMAP, which means they're very fermentable, and some are less fermentable. Some are sort of intact and some of them, we might manipulate in smoothies or soups so they have a smaller particle size. All of these different properties of fiber will impact your gut in different ways. Some fiber speeds you up and some fiber slows you down. Some fiber holds onto water and some fiber does a terrible job holding onto water. So when we just talk about eat more fiber, eat less fiber, we lose so much of the nuance around what people would benefit from maybe eating more of this type, but less of that type. And can we actually use certain types of fiber supplements to really kind of conquer chronic irregularity? And so there's so much nuance when it comes to fiber. And when you have bowel irregularity, it's so important to understand what type of fiber is your body going to do best with, at what amounts. Can you handle high? Do you need to be moderate? Do you need to be low? Can you handle more if it's that type, but a lot less if it's the other type? And so really getting down into the weeds on understanding what foods have what types of fiber and what types of fiber behave in what way in your body is crucial to figuring out how to eat properly for your type of GI issues.
Yeah, and I love that you do go into detail in your new book, Regular. And you had mentioned smoothies as far as fiber. And again, I always just like to use myself as an example because smoothies do really well with me. And of course, it's not to say that I don't consume fiber, but a lot of it is in maybe smoothie form, fruits and things, and it's pureed down. So it's not this crazy, I guess, bulk thing you're chewing that, of course, the more, I always like to explain this too, the more broken down something is like in a smoothie, the less your body takes to digest it, the less energy your body takes to actually digest it. But explain again, because you said the particles are broken down in a smoothie form, right? So would someone benefit from that as opposed to the alternative of just eating a salad?
Some people will. Again, it depends on the person. And so, by definition, all fiber is indigestible. Nobody digests fiber. Nobody's body can digest fiber, period. The question is, what kind of impact does that indigestible fiber have when it lands in your colon? And when you think about it, I always give the example of kale, right? Like kale, if raw kale, it's coarse, it's bulky. Even if you chew it, how small do your teeth really break a big kale leaf down? Those pieces are probably still pretty intact. And so however well you chew it or however poorly you chew it is pretty much the physical space it is going to occupy moving through your GI tract because you cannot break down fiber any further. You don't have enzymes for that. And so, picture how stimulating all of that coarse, however well you chewed it up kale might be to an irritable bowel, or how bloating it might be to a very backed up full bowel, like if you're very constipated. Now take that same amount of kale and throw it in a blender in your mind's eye. And now you're taking the particle size of that fiber down to this eensy weensy teeny beanie. On paper, it still has the same exact number of grams, but in your body, physically, it impacts you in such a different way. It's not so bulky. It doesn't take up as much space. And so if someone is really prone to being overstimulated by raw vegetable, salad, bulky things, the greens in a smoothie may not bother you at all. It kind of just slides on by. Or if you're really, really backed up and full and like there's just no room in your bowel because you're kind of chronically constipated, but you still don't want to eat unhealthily and you want to get all the nutrients from these things, you might find that eating these things in a smoothie form or pureed soup form is a way that's going to just feel a little bit less uncomfortable if your bowel is running fuller. And so those are great examples of ways that I might use sort of smaller particle size fiber to help people tolerate difficult to tolerate fiber, so that they don't have to completely exclude those foods from their diet if they want to get the nutrition from it.
Yeah, that's a great example. And then I want to go back to the pelvic floor dysfunction for a second here. And so would you say that maybe a female after giving birth would have more issues with the pelvic floor, or would that not even have a play in it? Is it age? Like what makes, as we age, obviously things aren't working as they were when we were younger. And so does giving birth, contribute to that, or is that really not even part of the equation?
Giving birth is absolutely a risk factor for pelvic floor dysfunction. And frankly, so is even just carrying a pregnancy, right? I mean, pregnancy puts a ton of pressure on the pelvic floor muscles, even if you don't deliver a baby vaginally. And so pregnancy, yes, and certainly giving birth on top of that. But again, I still have plenty of patients who are, young women in their 20s who also have pelvic floor dysfunction, and men can also have it. And so certainly, childbirth and pregnancy are absolutely increased risk factors. And we really do see that women after 40 are kind of in that prime demographic to be affected by pelvic floor dysfunction.
Mm-hmm. So is it safe to say that IBS is more common for women than men?
So IBS is more common in women than men, but pelvic floor dysfunction is not IBS. Pelvic floor dysfunction is pelvic floor dysfunction, and IBS is IBS. And you could have both, but pelvic floor dysfunction isn't necessarily IBS.
All right, well, then let's get into IBS. The difference between IBS, because this is something too that is like a personal, just aggravating thing for me, is like people say, "Oh yeah, I have IBS," and I'm thinking, "Oh, really?" Like my heart goes out to you, and they're like, "Yeah, like I get bloated every once in a while," and I'm thinking, that's not IBS. That's just a little bloating. You know what I mean? And so the term IBS is just so loosely used, I think, that it could be literally, oh yeah, I get IBS. I'm constipated. I may skip a day of going to the restroom. And then the other end of the spectrum is someone says I have IBS, and they're literally every time they eat, they're in pain, they're constipated, or they're going to, they have diarrhea, and they're in so much pain where they get head fog and brain fog because of just dysfunction in their gut and this and that. And that term is considered IBS to a lot of practitioners. And I just feel like it's a blanket statement.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right on both ends. The thing that really separates IBS from just irregularity, because not all constipation is IBS and not all diarrhea is IBS. What makes IBS is the chronic abdominal pain. Pain is what separates IBS from just, I have loose stools, or I go to the bathroom a lot, or I'm constipated. It's the pain. People with IBS have visceral hypersensitivity. Their enteric nerves, the nerves in their gut, are really hypersensitive. It's almost like the pain thermostat is set to a much lower degree. And normal amounts of gas, or just normal processes like having to poop, creates pain or cramping or discomfort in a way that for other people, it does not. And so to your example around someone who's like, oh, I don't poop every day. That's not IBS unless skipping a day gives you tremendous discomfort and pain, right? Like if I don't have IBS. If I skipped a day of pooping, I probably wouldn't even notice. Like, I wouldn't realize it. And then I'd have to think about, oh, did I poop today? Someone with IBS who skips a day of pooping is in agony. It's all they think about all day long. Like, oh my God, I didn't go. I'm so uncomfortable. Like, it's that real hypersensitivity. And then the other example you gave is also right. It's just because somebody has irregular bowel movements and pain, so it doesn't mean that they have IBS. There's a lot of what we call IBS mimickers or, imposters that are conditions that look like IBS, like, oh, the person has frequent bowel movements or they're really constipated and they have some pain. But then when we start treating it like IBS, try the different diets for the IBS, try the different medications for IBS, like all the interventions that we know typically work to at least some degree for almost everybody with IBS, they don't respond to any of it. And when you start to see that in your practice, you also have to second guess, well, hey, maybe this is one of those conditions that looks like IBS, but actually isn't IBS. And let's actually dig a little deeper and see if we can find another cause, because it's not really responding in the way that we would expect IBS to respond.
Wow. I mean, there's just so many different factors, and it is so interesting that each person does have a different sensitivity. I've come across a lot of people and they're like, yeah, like I'll go twice a week and that's just normal for them. And I'm definitely on the other end where like, if I don't go once a day, then I'm like, nope, like everything's off. So it's so individualized. And now the term, let's talk terms again here. Like, so bloating, for example. The term bloating, I feel, also has a different term because someone could be like, oh, I'm bloated, I have gas, or like, I'm bloated, my belly is literally extended out, or I'm bloated, I just feel full, but my stomach is still flat. Like, describe all those different terms here.
Yeah, so it's great. It's a great question. So a lot of people, and what you're describing is people using the term bloating to refer to two different things. They're using the term bloating to refer to bloating and to distension. Distension is what you described as my belly is physically sticking out. My waistline is bigger. I was a 31 waist when I woke up this morning, and I'm a 33 waist when I go to bed at night, and I have to wear elastic pants or unbutton my pants because I literally can't fit into my clothes. That's distension. Distension could be painful and uncomfortable, or it could be completely not. It could literally just be, I look like I'm 7 months pregnant, but I feel fine. So distension is literally just the waistline is bigger. Bloating is a feeling, a subjective feeling of fullness or discomfort, just shy of pain, right? What makes bloating different than pain is that bloating is not painful. It's just like, it can be really uncomfortable. It could feel like you've overeaten, or it could feel like you can't breathe, like you're short of breath, or, you just like feel like just like that, like you feel kind of like stretched out, and like, it's uncomfortable up against my weight, like my pant line, and I just feel uncomfortable, but it's not like necessarily like sharp overt pain or cramping or gas pain. It's just discomfort. So you could just be bloated, like feel over full, but actually look flat. You could be bloated and distended. In other words, I feel uncomfortably full and I look really distended, or you could just be distended and not bloated. And so any of these things are possible.
Yeah, and that's really good for people to know, to also bring to their practitioner, because so many just medical doctors in today, it's again, they just look at you, and I could tell someone, I've actually, this has happened. I'm like, I'm bloated, but my stomach is not actually extended, but I have pain, but they're like, well, you don't know, Bethany, you're not bloated. Like, you look fine. And I'm like, I'm literally like, I can't even drink water. That's how bloated I feel. And so it's really good for people to know this, to really bring up to their practitioners, because it's super frustrating when they're having these feelings and, well, no, you feel fine or you look fine. And so that issue is not addressed.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I spent a lot of time in both of my books. So my first book is called The Bloated Belly Whisperer, and I talk a lot about bloating and helping people get the language right so they know specifically what to tell their practitioner. Because you could go in and say, I'm bloated, and your practitioner, what they think of bloated is they think acid reflux. So if you go to a practitioner and you have 10 or 11 minutes with them and you say bloating, and they think, and for them, bloating means indigestion, they'll put you on an acid reducing medication. When really maybe what you mean is that, your bloating is, related like lower GI, you're farting up a storm, or you feel like you have trapped gas, and your bloating might be you have too much gas in the bowel, or you're really constipated. And so if you know how to describe what you're feeling, you're going to be able to really convey the heart of the issue in a way that your provider understands. And it's a similar thing that I talk about in Regular, my next book, around being precise around the languages of what we mean by diarrhea and constipation, right? Like, so, when you said somebody might go twice a week, but feel perfectly fine, I mean, are they really constipated? Like, if they're not uncomfortable, they don't go often, but when they go, they get a giant, relieving, awesome poop, and they feel completely fine in between. On paper, someone that would meet the definition of constipation because they poop less than 3 times a week. But is that a problem that needs to be fixed? Whereas you might go every other day, which does not meet the technical criteria for constipation, but you're miserable. Or maybe you go 3 times a day, but every time you go, it feels incomplete and just not enough. And that's constipation. And so being really precise with your language, not just saying I have diarrhea or I have constipation, but tell your provider what's happening. I go this many times a day. This is what my stool looks like. This is how it feels when I'm passing my stool. It doesn't feel complete. I'm straining even to pass soft stools. Like, all of these details help you and your physician get on the same page about what could be going on with you. Because if you're telling them, like, I'm straining to pass soft stools, they are probably going to get straight to pelvic floor dysfunction. Whereas if you're like, when I have a nice soft, poop, it's very easy for me to pass it, but half the time I'm having just harder stools. Then they're thinking, okay, there's probably a little bit of slow transit here. Let's work on some fiber and some, osmotic laxatives to kind of soften things and speed them along. And so when you get precise with your description of your experience, your provider and you can really get on the same page about what could be causing it and how we're going to address it.
Yeah. Well, and you did bring up some good points that I want to also just address too. So you mentioned trapped gas. Now, this is something that I feel like a lot of people should really be aware of, because first of all, gas is normal. It's if you don't have gas, that's actually not normal. It's like burping. Like, we all have these different bodily functions. Having gas is a normal thing. You eat food, it creates gas, but you eliminate it. So the issue, correct me if I'm wrong, the issue isn't having gas. The issue is not being able to release the gas where it's trapped inside you and like it's causing pain, right?
Yeah, that's part of the issue. And then another issue we see with like IBS isn't necessarily that people can't pass it, but we do see some sort of like abnormal, I would just say like gas dynamics for a lack of a better way of describing it, which is like gas pools kind of, so it doesn't move through. It's sort of like a steady pace and it's not evenly dispersed always throughout the gut. But some people will find that like gas will pool and collect in a certain area. And then they can get like, oh, I always have, this pain like in this one area. And what we've really seen in some studies is that people with IBS who have a lot of pain and gas pain, they don't actually have more gas than somebody without IBS. They have the same amount of gas, but it does seem to be distributed less evenly and sort of, in a way in the bowel where it's more likely to kind of build up and cause more discomfort, distension, and pain because it's not just kind of flowing through and like even little bubbles. And that gas pooling effect can also be really, really uncomfortable.
Looking to build a more robust foundation in your health and well-being? From the producer of Digest This comes one of the most popular alternative health shows on Apple Podcasts, The Dr. Tina Show. Dr. Tina Moore is a naturopathic physician and chiropractor, traditionally and alternatively trained in science and medicine. The show features exclusive interviews with experts such as Sean Stevenson, Mike Mutzel, Mark Groves, and even solo episodes covering metabolic health, pharmaceuticals, chronic diseases, long hauler syndrome, and pain management. Dr. Tina delivers the information in a no-nonsense, real-world style, and she has the science to back it up. The Dr. Tina Show is edgy, entertaining, and informative. Every episode will leave you with a new pearl of health wisdom to expand your knowledge base. When you're empowered, you can do better for yourself, your family, and your community. Resilience is the name of the game, and Dr. Tina is here to guide you on your way. Listen to The Dr. Tina Show today on your favorite podcast app. New episodes every Wednesday. Produced by Drake Peterson and Resident Media.
So what advice would you give to someone that maybe feels like their gas is trapped. Like, oh, I really need to, like, for lack of a better word, I really need to fart, right? But that person is like, I can't. Like, if I could, I would, but like, it just feels like this gas is trapped and it's not going anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a lot of ways that we tackle the gas. And so one is, can we prevent the gas from happening? Two is, can we kind of prevent it from pooling? And three, it's, can we help you exit it? Or can we make it less uncomfortable for you? And four, can we help you exit it, right? There's all sorts of ways. And so, obviously, like a lot of people with IBS might limit certain quote unquote gassy foods, right? Higher FODMAP foods like beans or Brussels sprouts. Or nowadays, we have a lot of enzymes for FODMAPs that are available so that you can eat those gassy foods, but they won't cause gas because the enzymes will help them be more digestible. And so there are sort of like these newer FODMAP specific enzymes that we can use to even prevent the gas from happening. But what happens if we can't prevent the gas from happening, or, we can't prevent every single bit of gas from happening? People will use simethicone or Gas-X, and not just like once a day, but like with every meal, because what that does is it just breaks up big gas bubbles into tiny little gas bubbles. And so simethicone can kind of prevent that pooling effect, because it just helps prevent gas from gathering together into a giant bubble and being really uncomfortable, but it just allows it to stay small, little bubbles that are easily more dispersed. So some people will use that, kind of 3-4 times a day. Some people will use peppermint oil capsules because that will reduce the bowel's sensitivity to the presence of gas. And so we're not alleviating the gas, we're not even making the gas smaller, but we're making your bowel less annoyed and less tuned into the gas. And that's in one way that peppermint oil works. And then obviously, like, hey, can we get more gas out? I mean, a lot of people will do different types of like yoga poses, or kind of like gut directed kind of yoga poses, massages, kind of manually help that gas to flow. And so all sorts of ways to tackle chronic gas pain. Kind of depends on the person, but we have things that we can do.
Yeah. And you had mentioned simethicone and Gas-X and different things. And so coming from a more natural approach, someone that doesn't want to use those over-the-counter medications, I mean, first of all, would you recommend Gas-X? And what are the consequences or side effects from, constantly having to use that? Because no one wants to just constantly having to pop pills with each meal,
Well, I mean, look, people are different. I come from like a very neutral place in terms of holistic, not holistic. Like, I meet my patient where they are. I have a lot of patients who don't want to do anything and want to take everything naturally. And I have some patients that are like, oh my God, make this go away. Give me all the pills, And so I have solutions for everyone. If you don't want to use simethicone, then that's just something we take off the table. What I will say about it is, simethicone doesn't actually get absorbed into the body. It stays in the gut. It's a surfactant. It literally just attaches to the sort of outside of the gas bubble and breaks it up into little gas bubbles. And it's actually incredibly safe for long-term use. It's the active ingredient in an infant medication called Mylicon, which is what you give to colicky babies, like who are like too young to really like fart and like really pass their gas, and they get kind of gas pain and colicky. And so like we literally give it to newborn babies. And so it is one of the safest over-the-counter medications you could have, again, because it doesn't get absorbed into the body. It just stays in the gut and breaks up gas bubbles. There really are no like side effects. It doesn't interfere with absorption. It breaks up gas bubbles. Use it or don't use it. But if you use it 3 times a day for the rest of your life, it doesn't actually impact like your gut's function. It's literally just about breaking up gas bubbles. But I get that some people still don't want to use that, in which case we might try to use more things like enzymes to prevent the gas from even happening. Or you might use peppermint oil, which is a natural remedy that people feel sometimes a little bit more comfortable with when you're coming from the holistic angle. But I'm not aware of a natural, some people can use like fennel seeds. You can try chewing on fennel seeds, which can have a little bit of a similar sort of gas breaking effect. And so
there's a lot of different like licorice root tea and different things like that can help with digestion too.
Yeah. In terms of gas specifically, I think fennel would probably be more effective than licorice. I think licorice works a little bit more with like with dyspepsia and stomach, like indigestion, acid kind of indigestion. And fennel, I think, is a little bit more targeted to sort of gas.
Okay. And going back to Gas-X, would you recommend that for maybe a pregnant woman?
Absolutely. Yeah. Our pregnant patients use a lot of Gas-X.
Okay. Hey, it's always good to ask. And then I did have another question just going back. You had mentioned previously talking about like little small poops because when someone says, oh, I'm constipated, yeah, I'm going 3 times a day, they're long and skinny and I can't get a full evacuation. And some people may be like, well, that's not constipated then. Like you're going, but it's literally like little pencils, And so what is happening when someone is pooping, again, like little pencils? What's going on?
So little pencils, you're often wondering about pelvic floor issues because a skinny poop means sort of a very sort of tight butthole for, to not to be too technical.
Yeah.
When the anal sphincter muscle cannot relax fully, cannot really fully open, it's almost like squeezing toothpaste out of a tube, right? Where you have like a really tiny opening and you're trying to squeeze stool out of it. And so it gets very, very skinny. And so sometimes that can mean like a hypertensive anal sphincter not fully relaxing, or its tone is just too tight when at rest and it just doesn't fully relax and open to allow like a full diameter stool to pass. And so if I hear skinny and incomplete, I'm often referring them to a gastroenterologist to have, some like maybe like a digital rectal exam. And if the physician's like, oh yeah, things feel really tight, they might refer them to other type of pelvic floor function testing to see, what's going on there.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. And then what about those that may go to the bathroom every single day, maybe even twice a day, but they still feel full, like more is in there. What's happening? And maybe, their poops are, quote, normal looking, right? It's a normal size. Why do they still feel full?
Well, I often see this in cases of just like fiber overload, right? You're able to have a completely normal stool, maybe even 2 a day. They're even sizable. And then you're like so bloated, so uncomfortable. And you sound to me like you're full of stool. So I send you off to your doctor. We get an x-ray and lo and behold, the x-ray comes back and your colon is packed completely full of stool. And we see that. And I often see that in patients who are, really health conscious, trying to do the right thing. We got the message about fiber this, fiber that. We're all reading fiber fueled and, we're like all super into the microbiome. And I have patients who are eating, 50, 60 grams of fiber a day, and they're just not keeping up with that in the bathroom. Even if they have 2 great poops a day, they are pooping out, 60% of what they take in. And with each passing day, that residual 40% is hanging around, and it builds up. And so, often I will see what you describe in somebody who's just like not keeping up with the amount of fiber that they eat.
So could they just not be drinking enough water?
No, it's not necessarily related to water. Some people hormonally kind of have what I call a window of poopertunity, which is sort of like their body will poop before 10 a.m. or before 12 p.m. Like their body will poop in the morning. Whereas some people, if they just eat more fiber, like they will poop in the afternoon. They might even poop in the evening. Like they'll poop when there's poop that needs to come out. Mm-hmm. And some people hormonally are really just getting the urge at a certain time of day. And so if they're just eating an incredibly high fiber diet, they may just not be getting the urges enough in their hormonal window to keep up with what they're eating. Mm-hmm. And I see that. I mean, it's not uncommon.
All right. Now, speaking of a higher fiber diet, let's go on the other end of the spectrum. Now, what is your take on a low residue diet?
So low residue is like a very imprecise term. And so I don't use it so much. But like when I think low residue, I'm actually talking about what you and I spoke about earlier, which is low particle size. Okay. So I think historically, like in the medical community, when they said the word low residue, they meant low fiber. Just eat chicken and rice, mm-hmm. And broth and applesauce and Jell-O and bananas. When I think about what we're trying to achieve with a low residue diet, I think I can achieve that with fiber containing foods as long as the particle size is teensy, right? Like the smoothies, the soups, right? And so, mashed sweet potato instead of eating a whole sweet potato with the skin, or hummus instead of like whole intact chickpeas with the skin, or smoothies where all the berries of the skins and the seeds of the berries are taken down to liquid, or a green smoothie, or, a pureed, vegetable soup or whatever. And so it's low residue in terms of it doesn't really leave a lot of intact stuff behind, but it is not overtly low fiber. And so I think that when the term low residue is used medically, like I don't know what we're even talking about, right? And so if I'm working with someone who has like Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis, inflammatory bowel diseases, where they just feel awful with salad and raw stuff and nuts and like kind of coarse intact fiber, I don't necessarily tell them don't eat fiber, right? What I tell them is, hey, when we're going to be eating foods that are fiber containing, here's what we're going to do to them to make them low impact, low particle size, gentle on your very inflamed, angry bowel. And so I prefer low particle size because I think it really is more precise around what we're talking about here.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it's a good distinction, as opposed to like a very voluminous piece, like a voluminous plate of food. If anyone has had a smoothie before, sometimes they don't even feel full after drinking a smoothie, but they could have had the same amount of food that they put in the smoothie just on a plate and eat it like that. And they're like, man, I'm full.
Exactly. It's so true.
So yeah, that's a good point. Now, speaking of different foods, can we talk a little bit about some constipation friendly foods? If you would recommend any. And then also regarding carbs specifically, now are carbs constipating?
So let's start with that second question and then go to the first. So no food really is actively constipating. In other words, there really are no foods that slow down your bowel. It's not like if you eat rice, your bowel motility is slower. Right? So no foods actively slow you down. And so like people are like, oh, but bananas, but rice. Those foods are, I think, more binding, but that's not the same thing as constipating. And so they have that reputation as being constipating because like the pectin and, and the starch, the resistant starch in those types of foods holds on to water in a way that if you were like having loose, watery diarrhea would actually cause your stool to be a little bit more formed. And somehow that like developed in our minds as, oh, they're constipating. Mm-hmm. So that's a different thing. Binding a loose stool is not the same as actively slowing you down and making you not go.
That's good. Go ahead.
Yeah. And then some people also feel like, well, I feel like bananas constipate me. And, I think what may be going on there is bananas really don't have very much fiber. And so if you are eating bananas as your primary fruit instead of like berries and, pears and like much higher fiber fruits, there's an opportunity cost there. Like you're not eating 4 or 5 grams of fiber per fruit serving. You're eating like 0 to 1. And so, it's not that the banana is actively constipating you, but it's certainly not helping you go in the way that like other fruits might. And so I think that, bananas are misunderstood in the pooping world. Certainly I don't recommend them for people who are constipated just because they're not actively part of the solution, but they're not going to like harm you if you eat them.
No, that was a good, because I hear that all the time. People are like, oh, I can't have bananas. They constipate me. Or some people say, oh, I can't have dairy because it constipates me, or bread or whatever.
I would never argue with somebody's subjective experience. Like if you feel when you eat more of those foods, you become more constipated, like I believe you, like your body is, is the Bible, but it also, again, may be the opportunity cost. Like when you're eating a lot of bread and sandwiches and pasta, guess what you're not eating? Fiber, right? And so there's also just that, like when the diet is higher in those foods, you may be going less or feel less regular, not because those foods are actively constipating you, but that you're not eating these other things that are actively helping you stay regular. So I think that there is a little bit of that going on. The only things that are really kind of actively constipating, maybe not the only, but the primary things from a nutrition standpoint are supplements of calcium and iron can be very constipating. And so, that's something to be aware of. And, my constipated patients who have anemia, it's really kind of tricky if they need an iron supplement. And we're like, oh God, I really don't want you to be taking a whole lot of supplemental iron because it's going to make constipation worse. So that's always kind of tricky to manage.
Yeah. Well, and then going back to the original question of the whole high fiber that could not be helping the solution, like with the traffic jam example, maybe fiber obviously doesn't constipate you, but it could definitely not help the situation, like you were saying, just adding more cars to the traffic jam.
Yeah, someone who's very, very backed up is going to find that lower fiber meals feel much better for them. And so I often hear like, this week, like I'm so bloated, so miserable, blah, blah, blah. And then this weekend I was like at a party and I was eating like crap and I just had like pizza and burgers, whatever. And my stomach felt so much better. And like, why is it when I eat junk food, I feel better? And anytime someone says that, I know they're full of stool, right? And when I eat my usual healthy diet, I feel worse. Like that's always like that red flag. Like, okay, well, I think I know what's going on here, And so I do hear that quite a bit.
So interesting. Yeah. And then what about some, quote, constipation friendly foods and things like that?
Yeah. So, there's a recent study that came out, a few studies actually around kiwis. And so 2 kiwis a day can really help with constipation. And so, fruit in general, because not only does it have fiber, but it also often has either fructose or sorbitol or like the type of sugar alcohols that have a natural, gentle laxative effect. And then among all the fruits, kiwi also seem to have like some very specific compound that can be helpful with constipation. And so we love kiwis. I like to use ground flaxseed as well. In my patients who tend to be constipated, like have them mix it into some oatmeal or yogurt or, doing like 1 or 2 tablespoons a day. And depending whether they struggle with gas or not, I may or may not use like dried fruits or even like, stone fruit juice, like either prune juice or pear or like apricot nectar or cherry juice, because the stone fruits have sorbitol or polyols, which again have like that sort of natural laxative effect. But again, if you're very, very gas prone or have a lot of gas pain, I probably wouldn't go there because some people can find those to be too gassy.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know we've talked about a lot of constipation issues, but what about the other end of the spectrum? Someone that may be going and they have loose stools all the time, or they get these random urgencies to go out of nowhere.
Yeah, great question. So again, it kind of depends whether we're dealing with a diarrhea predominant IBS or IBS-D, or whether it is sort of what I would call an IBS mimicker, or something that looks like IBS, but is not really being caused by sort of a functional bowel issue. If it's IBS-D, one of the most effective solutions that I use for someone who has IBS in the morning, especially their bowels are really active, they're running back and forth, 3, 4, 5 times. They have a hard time getting out of the house. And things are kind of like just incomplete and loose and very urgent in the morning. One of the most effective things that I use in those patients is a soluble fiber supplement taken the night before. Because what soluble fiber does, it is water soluble. It dissolves in water. It becomes viscous and gooey and gummy, and it holds onto water like a sponge. And it takes these little dribs and drabs, loosey-goosey pieces and pulls them all together into a nice, consolidated, formed, more complete bowel movement. So you get the urge to go, you get a much larger percentage of the stool out in one shot. Maybe you have a second urge and it's formed and it's more complete, and you're just consolidating your trips to the bathroom into 1 or 2 and you're good to go. You get it all done sooner. That can work really well for IBS-D. And so and then, in tandem with that, adjusting the diet so that more of the fiber that you eat is soluble fiber. Less of it is that roughagey, bulky, insoluble fiber that is really stimulating and it doesn't hold on to any water. And so we'll also manipulate the ratio of the types of fiber in somebody's diet. But what I call soluble fiber therapy can be really, really helpful for the classic IBS-D type of situation.
Okay. Now, for those listening, can you give us some examples of soluble fiber?
Sure. So there are sort of manufactured are like lab made soluble fibers, and there's natural ones. So in the lab made sort of pharmaceutical space, there's products like Citracel, which is methyl cellulose. There's Benefiber, which is wheat dextrin. And, there's a partially hydrolyzed guar gum, PHGG, which is sold as Sun Fiber, Regular Girl, Benefiber Digestive Advantage. On the natural end of things, you're looking at acacia fiber would be a natural soluble fiber. So you can buy generic acacia fiber. There's a product called Heather's Tummy Fiber, which is acacia. You could also use something like an oat bran to a similar effect. Mm-hmm. Oat bran is predominantly soluble fiber, and you could also use that as sort of a soluble fiber therapy if you wanted something more natural.
Yeah. And are there any, give us some like food examples or just food from nature, soluble food?
So oats and oatmeal is the absolute number one example of soluble fiber food. And because you think about it in your head, if you put oats into water and you walk away for 5 minutes and you come back, it's like sucked it all up like a sponge, like overnight oats, right? And that's because oats do such a good job with their soluble fiber, really absorbing and gelling in that way. But a lot of the fruits and vegetables that are soluble fiber are the ones that are not leafy and the ones that don't have thick peels or really peels of any kind. And so you're thinking like, butternut squash and like the flesh of sweet potatoes, but not the skin, and root vegetables like carrots and beets. You're thinking in terms of vegetable, well, I guess also avocado is a fruit that people think of a vegetable. In terms of fruit, you're thinking your melons, your papayas, your mangoes. You're thinking about the inside flesh of apples and pears, but not that thick apple skin. These are a lot of the soluble fiber predominant foods, zucchini, like the green beans, like these are the soluble fiber foods that really tend to be the more IBS friendly types of fruits and vegetables. Whereas the insoluble fiber foods can sometimes provoke people with IBS. These are things like, lettuce and spinach and kale and nuts and what else in terms of the veggies and the fruits, berries, like all the skins and the berries, and peas and corn, things with lots of skins, grapes with all the skins, the things that are lots of skins and leaves and crunchy coarse stuff, typically popcorn, can aggravate people with IBSD when they're eaten in larger amounts. Usually people can tolerate small amounts of them. It's just if they overdo it, they pay for it.
Yeah. But what about if you remove the skins?
Yeah. Well, if you remove the skins, then obviously you're you're changing the ratio of insoluble to soluble. So I often tell my IBS patients, peel your apple before eating the apple. If you want to eat eggplant, like take that thick skin off of it and then just have the nice soft flesh on the inside. And so, when you can take your skin off of the cucumbers and then the inside is soluble and then we got rid of the insoluble. So taking the skins off of things can absolutely be something that's super helpful. I recommend it all the time.
Yeah. And that's even something too that I've experienced, and as well as when I tell my followers, I'm like, do you, like, for example, almonds? I was like, you could soak your almonds, you remove the skins from the almonds, and they're like, oh my gosh, I can digest them better. And of course, there's like the phytic acid and the soaking and all that, that goes with it. But it's just so interesting how one little change just by removing the skins can make a huge difference in someone's digestive health.
Yeah, absolutely. And for people who are still very sensitive, then I tell them almond butter, right? Then it's still all the nutrition of almonds, but it's pureed and it's just a little bit gentler. And so that kind of comes back to the particle size conversation, right? Like we don't want to just completely write off all of these foods if we can find a texture modification that makes them more agreeable.
Yeah. Now, again, so the soluble fiber is for those that have maybe I don't want to say diarrhea, because what if it's not... what if it's not like diarrhea is technically, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's like watery, right?
Not necessarily watery, but it's it's unformed. It's a stool that takes the shape of the container, which is a kind of gross way to think about it, but like something that really doesn't have much form. But even if they're not watery or loose or, or diarrhea-ish, urgency is a really big one, right? Like a lot of people with diarrhea, predominant IBS, just have a lot of urgency. Even if the stool is formed, the urge to go hits them really quickly and they're feeling like they just have to race off to the bathroom with, not a lot of time. And so people who have that type of urgency or frequency, they just they eat anything and they're running off to the bathroom. Modifying the type of fiber to be more soluble can be a really helpful approach.
Yeah. Okay. Those are great tips. And then real quickly too, can we just address Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis? And can you explain the differences between the two? Because maybe someone is suffering and they don't even know they have it.
Yeah. So Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis are both forms of inflammatory bowel disease, or IBD, which is not the same as IBS. IBD is an autoimmune condition. And it is actually inflammatory. So there is inflammation somewhere in the GI tract. The main difference between Crohn's disease and colitis is where the disease can be active. So with ulcerative colitis, the disease is only active in the colon or the large intestine. With Crohn's disease, there can be disease activity anywhere throughout the GI tract, your small intestine, your colon, anywhere. And so that's kind of the primary difference between the two. And sometimes it can be a little bit hard for doctors to tell them apart, because if you have Crohn's colitis or the Crohn's disease is active in the colon, sometimes it can be a little bit tricky to know, which is which. And it's important for doctors to know, because actually the conditions do respond to different treatments. And, with Crohn's disease, if it's in your colon and you kind of get the disease quiet down, there's nothing to say that it can't pop up later in a different neighborhood. Whereas with colitis, it really just is in the colon. And, for inflammatory bowel diseases, part of being diagnosed with IBS is first making sure that it's not IBD. So the way that a doctor is supposed to diagnose you as IBS is they're going to ask you about your symptoms, the pain, the bowel movement stuff, and then they do 2 tests to rule out other conditions. They check your blood to see if you have celiac disease, or possibly have celiac disease. And they check your stool to see if you have an elevation in an inflammatory marker called calprotectin, which would be, could you have inflammatory bowel disease? If we've ruled out inflammatory bowel disease from your stool test and we don't have celiac disease, then the doctor can make a positive diagnosis of IBS if your symptoms meet the criteria.
Okay. No, those are everyone should know this, because a lot of practitioners may not even address this. So it's good for the patient to be informed in what to really address when, they are wanting to speak with their doctor. Now, and I love this too, that just on your website, you have, it's a regular quiz test, and you can go there. We'll make sure that we link it in today's show notes. It's thebloatedbellywhisperer.com. And people could go on there. They can take this regular quiz, and it's quite fun. I was doing it last night, and so it's great. And then of course we have your book, which you have 2 books, but your most recent one is regular. I highly suggest everyone take a look and grab this book. We'll put a link in today's show notes as well. And if you could give one piece of advice before departing, what would that be for someone with digestive issues? I know that's a hard question, but, what would that be?
Yeah, what I encourage everybody to do is to really do the best that you can to, zero in on your individual issue, your individual personalized experience. There is so much one-size-fits-all advice about irregularity online, on Instagram, like eat these foods for bloating, or avoid these foods, or eat these for constipation. And or, your trainer says, oh, you should do this diet. And your sister's like, oh, I did this diet. This helped me. Your problem, you might have diarrhea or you might have constipation, but as you'll see in my book, I have 10 different causes for diarrhea in my book. And I have 3 different reasons that you might be constipated. And so just because someone says that they have the same symptoms as you doesn't mean they have the same cause of the symptoms as you. And so if someone else has, their diarrhea is from IBS-D, but your diarrhea is from what we call bile acid malabsorption, or your diarrhea is from sucrose intolerance, you guys have very different remedies for your problem, even though you both are complaining of urgent bowel movements, loose bowel movements, smelly bowel movements, whatever. And so, diet and medication and treatments are not one size fits all for diarrhea or for constipation. The whole goal of my book and the whole goal of the quiz is to help individuals home in on what is your individual cause so that you can quickly identify a relevant, personalized, tailored solution for you that's going to work. And it may not be the same thing as, your best friend, your sister, your trainer.
Yeah, that's a great takeaway. Well, thank you so much, Tamara, for coming on the show. It was such a pleasure. We're going to have you back, maybe for your 3rd book. Who knows, right?
Oh God, please, Bethany, don't curse me like that. I'm still trying to get through my 2nd one.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Digest This. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review in your podcast app to let us know. If you're ever wondering how you can support me and this podcast, sharing it with your friends and family is the best way. This is a Resonant Media production produced by Drake Peterson and edited by Chris McCone. To email the show, message us at digestthispod@gmail.com. See you next time. The content of this show is for educational and informational purposes only. It is not a substitute for individual medical and mental health advice and does not constitute a provider-patient relationship. As always, talk to your doctor or health team first.